LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Steve Taylor, who joins us to discuss his book, Not I, Not Other Than I, The Life and Teachings of Russel Williams. Russel Williams is one of the most remarkable enlightened spiritual teachers of our time. After an early life of extreme hardship, leaving school at the age of 11 and becoming an orphan shortly afterward, he underwent a spiritual awakening at the age of 29. Since the late 1950s, he has been a spiritual teacher and is still actively teaching now at the age of 94. Previously, Russel has avoided publicity and never published any writings or transcripts of his talks, preferring to work quietly with small groups. Not I, Not Other Than I is the first time any details of his teachings or of his life have appeared in print. The book is partly a record of his teachings and partly the story of his extraordinary life. Steve and I also discuss the evolution of consciousness, the process of personal awakening, and the crumbling barriers between contemporary science and spirituality. Hello and welcome, Steve, and thank you so much for joining us once again on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Hi there, it's great to be back.
Well, Steve, today we're going to talk a little bit about a book that you have helped assemble. The book is called Not I, Not Other Than I, The Life and Teachings of Russel Williams, as a name that may be unfamiliar to many listeners. Before we talk about that, tell us a little bit just about your personal background and work, and then perhaps you can move on to just saying about Russel himself and how you discovered his work.
Okay, well, my own background is I'm an author of several books on spirituality and psychology, and also of books of spiritual poetry. And I'm also a lecturer in psychology, in transpersonal psychology at university. But I've always been a spiritual explorer. And back in the late 1990s, I'd been living abroad, and I came back to the UK, where I live now. And I was keen to find a group of sort of spiritually minded people. And I began to attend some groups. I went to a Gurdjieff group. I was kind of feeling around and looking for my own path, my own path of awakening. And I met a guy who, he was actually at a Gurdjieff group, a guy called Tony. And he told me about this enlightened spiritual teacher in Manchester who very few people knew about. Who held twice weekly meetings, but it was very it wasn't really secretive, but nobody really knew about this guy, and this guy didn't promote himself or publicize himself. Very few people knew about him, and this was Russel Williams, who at that time was in his late 70s, and my friend took me along to his meetings, and they were quite small. There were maybe 10 people there, maybe 15 at the most. But there was a power that I sensed immediately in Russel's meetings, and I began to attend them regularly, every week or every 2 weeks. And I've been doing that for the last 17 or 18 years now. I've been attending Russel's meetings, and as I say, finally, last year, Russel decided to publish a book of his teachings after being, unknown and unpublicized for so long.
Well, I must admit, his name was absolutely new to me when I discovered your book. But his life story, really, which the way you formatted the book is to alternate between a sort of a biographical thing, and then also his teachings themselves. But his life story is absolutely remarkable. I mean, it's particularly the way it seems to split into two halves. His early life and a lot of the, internal and external suffering that he went through. And then this kind of whole other second half where this transformation of his life opening up into something else.
That's right. Yeah, he does. Even from a historical point of view, Russell's life is quite amazing. He lived through so many of the important events of the 20th century. And he was born in 1921. He was born into poverty, and both of his parents died by the time he was 11. And he left school at the age of 11 and went through a lot of deprivation and a lot of suffering. And he was involved in the war. He was at Dunkirk during the Second World War. He lived through the Blitz. And so the war was a very tumultuous time for him, as for so many other people. And at the end of the war, he felt broken down, completely, broken to pieces emotionally and physically. And so in a sense, the suffering, the psychological turmoil which he went through during his early life, following the death of his parents and also during the war, in a sense, that seemed to create it seemed to generate the spiritual awakening which arrived a few years after the war. So he underwent his spiritual awakening in about in the mid-1950s, I think, or the early 1950s, when he was 29 years old.
Yeah, this is very early for something like this to be happening in terms of the 20th century, spiritual tradition. We think, for example, of the Eastern philosophy and traditions being brought to the West by people like Alan Watts, and then you have someone like Russell undergoing this traumatic transformation, really that early on, and yet his path, the beginning of that transformation, as you say, was very much still personal and involving those people immediately around them, whereas the trend quite quickly became, particularly in the 60s, publish a book, give lectures, bring this awakening from the East to the West. And it's just striking how personal and intimate his journey has been compared to so many other people that, had he been a self-publicist, that he might have become categorized with.
That's true, yeah. I mean, in some ways, Russell's contemporaries were people like Alan Watts, maybe Douglas Harding, and other teachers who are much more better known than him. But, certainly at the time when he underwent his awakening, there was very little popular knowledge of Eastern traditions in England or in the UK. And as a result, he found it very difficult to understand what happened to him. He underwent this major shift in awareness, and he lost the sense of separation to other people and other beings. And he felt this amazing sense of spaciousness and emptiness inside him. And he tried to explain it to people, but nobody understood him. He tried to approach clergymen, and they thought he was being blasphemous, and they thought he was crazy. So eventually he began to doubt it as well. He began to think that he might be crazy. But he had a chance meeting in 1959 with a Buddhist called John Gary, who was one of the founder members of the Buddhist Society of London, I think, one of the first Buddhist societies in the UK. And he was finally, after years, Russell met somebody who understood him, who could translate and comprehend his the way he was experiencing the world. So after that, it gave Russell a lot of confirmation, and the Buddhist Society of London and then the Buddhist Society of Manchester kind of adopted Russell because they saw him as a living embodiment of the spirituality they were investigating. And that they found that Russell could confirm a lot of original Buddhist teachings. So they adopted him as a teacher. And ever since then, Russell's been affiliated with particularly the Buddhist Society of Manchester. Even though he doesn't consider himself a Buddhist, he's been the president of the Buddhist Society of Manchester since the 1970s. But yeah, I think you're right. I mean, Russell never sought out publicity. He never promoted himself. He always felt that he could be most effective working with small groups, bringing about intense personal transformation in individual people. And it was really only it was about 5 years ago when I said to Russell, have you ever thought about writing a book? Do you think you should leave a record of your teachings? And finally he said, well, he was dubious at first because he said, my teachings, they're experiential, they're based on a level of feeling which probably wouldn't come across in a book. But just about 2 or 3 years ago, he wasn't in good health, and he decided it would be a good idea to leave a record of his teachings for future generations. So we decided to work on a book together.
Well, it's interesting you mention, of course, him confirming some Buddhist teachings, but not considering himself a Buddhist. I mean, is it possible to sort of characterize, for people who are perhaps listening to this and going, okay, well, what's the essence of what he's saying? What other tradition is there that I can hang this on to in order to get a handle on it? I mean, because the Eastern tradition, there's a Western mystical and esoteric tradition as well, and it's not just all Eastern stuff, although that was what was being popularized at the time. So is it possible to characterize the essence of his teachings, or is that simply not easy to do because it is so experiential?
Well, it is non-traditional. It's not really affiliated to any tradition. And that's one of its appeals, I think, because it's very pure and it's very kind of unfiltered through concepts or beliefs. There's very little framework, there's very little conceptual framework involved in it. It is extremely experiential. I guess you could say it points to a kind of core of experiential spirituality which lies behind a lot of different traditions, which is kind of at the core of many different spiritual traditions. And I guess Russell came upon this state through his own individual experiences. He didn't come into it through any particular tradition. So essentially for him it is an experiential state. But I guess you could say it's based on the experience of connectedness. It's based on the experience of oneness with all of reality, and it's based on the experience of consciousness, on the experience of an all-pervading consciousness which manifests itself within our individual being, but which is also always the essence of our individual being. Often we lose contact with this essential consciousness because of the activity of our minds, because we build up concepts and psychological attachments, and we may lose contact with it and begin to experience ourselves as purely individuals who live in separateness. But the essence is always there, and we can disentangle our concepts, we can empty our minds, we can gain a state of inner stillness, and then we can gain contact with that essential consciousness.
Thinking about different spiritual traditions and paths that other people have taken, and then that people who have come after them have said, I want some of what you've got, can you show me? I think that has tended to evolve, and this is, of course, where a lot of, well, if not all the religions come from. But even something like Buddhism, for me, when I looked at that, and not to single that out, but other similar things, was that there was too many isms and too many ists, and there was a uniform, and there were rules, and if that didn't make sense to you personally 100%, well, it was like, well, this is what it is, and this is the path. And what I liked about reading about Russell's teachings was that you're here now. There is no place to go to, if you see what I mean. It's right here now. And I think certainly mainline religions teach that there's off some distant, over the horizon, something you should be questing for. But a lot of even more contemporary and what we would call developed and nuanced spiritual traditions are still teaching striving for something. And I think that's born really from just our basis in linear time, that there's something for us to strive to become, and that, well, will we ever become it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think in some ways, on a material level, we're trained in our culture to think in terms of achieving ambitions, to think in terms of becoming a millionaire by the time you're 30 years old, or to become the president of a corporation by the time you're 50 years old. Well, they're quite extreme examples, but we are trained to think in terms of fulfillment lying in the future through success, through achievement, or through wealth. And I think in some ways we translate that into a spiritual level, and we think in terms of achievement as enlightenment, which lies at the end of a path of striving. So it's really kind of a spiritual translation of our focus on material achievement. And although at the same time, I don't think it's completely misguided, because I think of awakening or wakefulness. It can be a gradual path which people need to take, and awakening can mean a subtle change in the structures of our consciousness or in the structures of our being. And there are certain practices which you can use as a means of creating those changes. You can meditate every day or twice a day, and it will bring about subtle changes in the structures of your consciousness. And those changes will bring about an opening of your being, an awakening of your being. But the problem is, if you focus on that in a very egoic and a very goal-orientated way, if you allow the impulse to grow, or the impulse to move towards awakening, if you allow it to manifest itself in a very organic and a very kind of holistic way, then I don't think it's particularly problematic.
Well, I suppose what we could say then is, yes, the possibility of a gradual awakening, perhaps to the realization that you were always there in the first place, if you see what I mean. A kind of a peeling away of illusion and unreality.
Yeah, you could say that essentially we are awake, or at least the potential for awakening is always there. But we have to somehow allow that potential to unfold, and there could be a process that we need to engage in order for that potential to unfold.
I thought it was very significant, and this is certainly very familiar to anyone who's read around these subjects, that he did not understand, could not really comprehend what was happening to him. And this is very characteristic of people who do go through a sort of traumatic transformation. And I think his experience certainly embodies, I think, we could call transformation through suffering, which is not how it happens to everyone. Some people, as you say, take this gradual path, and there is no one moment that seems to be pivotal. Some people seem to be born just a little bit different from those around them, almost as if they're carrying something, whether from another life or whether we think about epigenetics or something. But there just seems to be these different paths and different ways. But for Russell, it was very much almost like his psyche, his soul, however you want to characterize his essence, couldn't take anymore. That's right, yeah. I mean, I think you're right. I think there are those three different modes in which awakening can occur. There are a few people who just seem to be naturally awakened to some degree. And their task, the only problem they have is, when they reach early adulthood and when they begin to, the problem they may have is understanding their natural wakefulness. They may live in a culture which doesn't accept it, so their own instincts may clash with the values of their culture. And I think certainly, I would class myself as somebody who was naturally awakened to some degree. And the problem I had was that the culture I lived in just didn't accept my wakefulness. So in a similar way to Russell, I was quite confused, and I thought I was a bit crazy, and I wondered what was wrong with me. And it was only later on, when I was in my early 20s, that I started to read books about spirituality. I began to meditate. I began to attend spiritual groups. Then I started to build up a framework which allowed me to understand my own being, and then I began to accept myself, and everything became much easier. And there are many people who have they seem to have an innate impulse to move towards the wakeful state, and they're often the people who gravitate towards meditation, or begin to maybe they are the people who become Buddhists and follow the Eightfold Path of Buddhism. They often like to have a framework which can allow them to develop their spirituality, and which can allow them to move towards wakefulness in a very gradual way.
But in my experience, in my research, by far the most common way in which awakening can occur is through intense psychological turmoil. So it occurs very suddenly and very dramatically after a long period of stress and turmoil, which could be connected to the kind of sufferings which Russell went through, intense emotional turmoil and stress over a few years. Or it could be due to a sudden moment of bereavement, or a diagnosis of cancer, or several years of depression or of failure and loss. But that does seem to be the most common way in which awakening occurs.
Yeah, for some, sadly, trauma that you describe is when they are facing death.
Yeah.
And they perhaps think, well, this stuff that I spent my life accumulating, whatever it happens to be, is that what I really wanted more of? And it's unfortunate when that happens, but that seems to be fairly common as well. And we all talk, we've all read about this sort of deathbed revelation. And I guess that's the ultimate challenge, isn't it, to our ideas about the nature of reality and who we are and what we are not.
Although, even if people undergo that shift not long before the end, they still don't regret it. They still don't feel that it's too late or it's come too late, because it's such a positive, powerful transformation that it seems to justify itself. And often it can be, for example, if somebody's diagnosed with cancer, they may be told that they have a few months left to live, or maybe 18 months left to live. And often the transformation happens quite suddenly, soon after their diagnosis. In some cases, straight away after their diagnosis. And that means that they live out the last few months of their lives in this tremendously invigorated and connected and joyous, positive state. And they sometimes say, if only I'd known this earlier. They sometimes say, why didn't I realize that it was so easy? The answer was always there, and the truth was always there. It was so easy, but it was always in front of my nose, but I just didn't see it. But there's no sense of regret or bitterness, because the joy is so powerful and all-encompassing in that moment. And sometimes if people are really, really lucky, they go into remission, they recover from their cancer. And usually, in my research, I've found that the state of wakefulness continues. It doesn't fade away. It continues as an ongoing, stable state. So they live the rest of their lives in this higher functioning, awakened state.
Well, I've done a lot of work in my own time and with these shows as well about the interaction of mind and matter, mind and body. And science has been bearing out this for some time. It's just that the actions and interactions are not consistent and they're difficult to replicate in a conventionally scientific way. But the fact remains that with the evidence that I've seen, I'm convinced that there's something here. And that, for example, the case that you would describe there, a theoretical case of someone who's supposedly terminally ill, they have some kind of revelation, and then they go into remission. I've read about those cases as well, and it seems that it's the shift in their perception that has had something to do with that. It's not that they had any conscious thought that, well, I've been diagnosed as terminally ill, my whole perception has changed, why didn't I realise, that this was so easy? It's not that they had any thoughts about getting better as such, but it's I've read, there's been documented cases of this, and again, some research I've read has suggested that there was a positive correlation there, but whatever science has to say about it, for those individuals concerned, that's an incredible blessing.
Oh yeah, definitely, yeah. Going back to Russell, after his awakening, at the time he was working in a circus. He spent about 3 years grooming horses in a circus, and incidentally, the caring for the grooming of the horses, he later realised it was a kind of spiritual practice which enabled his awakening to take place. It created a sense of stillness within him that enabled his awakening to occur. But after that, he realised that he had healing powers. He could heal horses. So vets would always be constantly amazed at Russell's power to heal horses who were injured, and and he found that he could heal. He had healing powers with human beings as well, and the power to heal other people is obviously related to the power to heal yourself, and I think it's related to an energy. Once you become awakened, you have access to this tremendous energy, which is not just your own energy. It's kind of universal energy. It's a super conscious universal energy which flows through you. I mean, it's always inside us, but as we said earlier, often because we're so individualistic and separate, we lose contact with it. But when your own separate sense of identity falls away and you no longer experience yourself as separate, you gain access to this incredibly powerful energy, this universal energy, which is the essence of your being. So my feeling is, I don't know much about this area, but my feeling is that healing energy, whether it's self-healing or whether it's the ability to heal other people, that's in some way related to this powerful universal energy which we gain access to.
Well, I think in that we can see the importance, in one respect, of Russell's ideas about working with small groups, because I think that an individual, and you'll have experienced this directly, an individual with that sort of energy can change the atmosphere in a room amongst a group of people very, very profoundly. And we can all think of situations we've been in where, positively and negatively, the atmosphere has been changed amongst a group of people because of just one individual in that group. Yeah. And I think that when you come to large scale attempts to do this, it seems to be less effective. I'm thinking of people broadcasting television programs, or these days with, global mass media 24/7, that some of it seems to get dissipated. And I think the most powerful, not to completely write any of that off, but the most powerful effects seem to be, if not quite one-on-one, but one person being in, just in a room and just altering the tone, the colour of the energy in the room itself.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I mean, and yeah, that is probably why Russell has always wanted to work in small groups. And certainly one of the reasons why people attend Russell's meetings is because he has this tremendous personal radiance. Some people have been attending the meetings for 40 years or more, and the main reason they go is not so much to listen to what he says, even though he says tremendously wise and profound things. It's often just to absorb the atmosphere of peace which seems to radiate from him and which seems to fill the room of the house where the meetings take place. And it's a well-known phenomenon particularly in the Hindu tradition. It's a phenomenon of satsang and darshan, which is when, in darshan, traditionally in Indian spirituality, followers would sit by the feet of their guru, not to listen to what he said, but simply to absorb his or her radiance, to absorb the wakefulness which would radiate from them. And I think that's what's one of the effects. When people awaken, they do develop this tremendous radiance, which becomes very attractive, and people are instinctively drawn towards them. And it's like bathing in a tremendous glow of serenity. And you can definitely feel, I can definitely feel that in Russell's company. But I think you're right. I think in larger groups, then that radiance tends to be dissipated. It seems to be most powerful. Maybe there's some sort of effect with distance that is most powerful when you're in close proximity to people.
The barriers that have been erected between science and spirituality, and bearing in mind that those are just two words that we have, two naming concepts for things that can't really be just expressed in terms of language, I think are a lot more fluid and malleable than many people believe. So if someone's listening to this and going, well, I don't really consider myself spiritual, this all sounds a bit new age, think about, in terms of what you just said, think about someone in your life who makes you feel good and why that is. And I'm not just talking about your partner who might say nice things to you and say, I love you. But you'll meet people in life who make you feel good. And you will meet people in life who on some level disturb you, and you don't seek their company out, or you move away from them. Maybe people gravitate towards you. Maybe people move away from you, and so there's this energetic exchange here. So I think what we're talking about are actual tangible effects that everybody can experience. But I think people who consider themselves not spiritual, people who consider themselves quite hard-headed and scientific, if they experience some of these phenomena and many others, such as synchronicity and all the rest of it, they'll tend to just give it another name, as if that makes it something different. Synchronicity is one of my favorite subjects, and certain people will say, well, there's no such thing as synchronicity, it's just a coincidence. But, well, you've just called it a coincidence. If someone else calls it a synchronicity, it didn't change the event. You can call it a hamburger. Still the same experience, if you see what I mean. So we have this tendency to say, well, yeah, I had that experience, and this guy over here had the same experience, but it's not the same experience because one's scientific and one is spiritual.
Yeah, that's right. That's a good point. I mean, in psychology, there's a phenomenon called mood contagion, which, you can guess what it means. It's, if you go into a room and somebody's in a bad mood, you'll pretty soon be in a bad mood yourself, and moods tend to spread from person to person, so that, in an office environment, for example, after a while, people tend to be in the same mood. A bad mood will spread, or a good mood will spread. People naturally tend to pick up the mood of other people. And you could say that maybe that's a psychologist might say it's some sort of cognitive or some sort of imitation. But equally, you could explain it in terms of some sort of energetic exchange, or some kind of intangible atmosphere which is in the room. And certainly, things like atmospheres, you can sense the atmosphere in a room when you go into it. And almost as if there is some kind of radiance or some kind of aura there. And another example is empathy, because everybody agrees that empathy exists. But conventional psychologists would probably explain it in terms of a cognitive ability to understand other people, to guess what other people are thinking. So it's a kind of like the ability to imagine how other people are experiencing things, the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes, which is fine, but in reality, empathy is actually more than that, because empathy is some kind of exchange. It's the ability to actually sense what another people is experiencing, as if you are them. So in a sense, empathy means transcending individuality and entering the being of another person. So it's not just a cognitive ability.
Well, I guess the placebo effect is another good example of this. On one hand, people say, yes, it's a placebo effect. Other people will say, well, it's mind-body interaction. Because, by definition, a placebo doesn't do anything. So therefore, it's what's at work there. A hard-headed materialist, scientist would say, will accept the placebo effect, but not anything beyond that, not any of the implications as to what processes might be at work. Because if, in controlled tests, someone, is given a placebo, someone's given drugs, and the person with the placebo experiences a healing effect, well, what did that? Where did that come from? It has to come from somewhere, but if the healing has taken place.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, I mean, I think scientists don't really consider the implications of the placebo effect. It becomes just an easy way of ascribing, strange phenomena, an easy way of sort of writing them off, explaining them away. I guess it's similar in some ways to quantum physics, because there are so many anomalous phenomena involved in quantum physics, and it makes so little sense from the view of conventional materialism. But most scientists, obviously, they accept that quantum physics exists, they accept that quantum phenomena take place, but they don't consider the implications of them. They sometimes say, they'll make sense eventually, somebody will come up with an idea that makes sense of all this weird stuff. Or they just say, that's the quantum world, this is the real world, this is the macrocosmic world, so what happens in the quantum world doesn't really apply to that macrocosmic world. But really, they're reluctant to consider the implications because they know instinctively or unconsciously, that it will, it kind of contravenes the basic principles of the materialistic worldview.
I know, and I never quite understood why there would be so much resistance to that. And then as years went by, I began to understand ideas about careers and grants and reputations and all the rest of it. But people in general, are quite happy to be led by science wherever it happens to go. And if you look at how science has changed over the centuries, there have been some pretty radical revelations where it's like, okay, folks, burn those old books. This is the way it is now. So you would imagine that going with this, if mainstream science did it, just sort of, if not en masse, but a significant school of scientists said, no, this is the new paradigm and we're showing you this, that people would, if not other scientists, that people in general would say, okay, that's the way it is. The implications are what they are, but because it wouldn't change the macro world as such, you still get up in the morning and go to work and what have you. So it just seems strange that there must be something deeper in there about the implications.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think the problem is that it's a very powerful human need to have a narrative framework which makes sense of reality, and it's that impulse which gives rise to the religious impulse. That the urge to accept a religion, to believe in a religious worldview, is because it explains everything. It gives you a narrative framework which makes sense of the whole of reality, and it gives a meaning to every activity in your life. That's not the only impulse, it's one of the major impulses which creates a religious worldview. But that applies to materialistic scientists too. They have a framework which makes sense of reality. They know that, in inverted commas, they know that the basic stuff of life is atoms, which form into molecules and which give rise to life forms. And they know that matter is the only reality and that the whole world can be explained in terms of the interaction of material particles. They know that consciousness is produced by the brain. They know that since we're just physical entities, when our bodies die, we will die. There will be no life after death, and so on. It's a narrative framework which makes sense of life. It gives structure, an explanation, and a kind of meaning to existence. So to have that framework questioned or contradicted is quite dangerous, because it takes away people's sense of orientation. It takes away, it destroys the whole framework which their life is centered around. So it's very similar to the way that religious people will cling to their beliefs, no matter how irrational they are, no matter how much evidence there is against them. Fundamentally religious people will still cling to their beliefs because it's a framework which makes sense of their lives. So scientists are the same. Well, some scientists are the same. That they will explain away any anomalous phenomena. They will completely disregard any evidence for telepathy or precognition. They will refuse to consider the implications of quantum physics or of the placebo effect because, they feel threatened by them, because they know that their worldview is threatened by these phenomena.
Well, thinking about the mind-matter interaction, this idea of consciousness being the ground of being, the root of everything, of the energy extending beyond the body, and of energy beyond the body, being absorbed into the body. What, in terms of, Russell's teachings and other similar ways of looking at reality, what you come to the sort of conclusion that, who am I versus what am I leads us to the thought we are not our bodies, essentially. The essence of what we are is not these, as someone described, meat sacks that we use to navigate this 3D reality. And that in itself is powerful. And I think that's one of the revelations at the heart of awakening in many different traditions and in many different ages.
That's true, but I would say that we are not just our bodies. We are our bodies, but we're not just our bodies. I think if you think of the body as a kind of vehicle which you live within, and not a part of your identity, I think that leads to a potentially dangerous predicament where you deny the body and you think of the body as something lower than you, which is of little value. And a lot of religions throughout history, a lot of spiritual traditions throughout history have done that. They've been quite anti-physicalists. They've been quite world denying, and they've had a very hostile, negative attitude to the body. And towards sex. So I would say, I mean, my own view is that, you know, there's a kind of like a tantric or a Taoist view that the body is sacred, but the body is not just a material thing. The body is infused with the spiritual. So the spiritual energy, which is our essence, is also the body. You know, the spiritual energy manifests itself as the body. So essentially, everything in the body, everything of the body, is sacred and spiritual. And there's really no distinction between spirit and the body. The body is spirit, and you know, it's therefore sacred and spiritual.
Okay, yes, Steve. I will modify what I said because I actually agree with you. There was a thought there that I went with, and I guess that thought came from the place of not overemphasizing the physical as if that's all there is. But you're right, it is a balance, and yes, that religious tendency to have this disgust of the body, whether it's sexual desire or whether it's disease, or whether it's a other natural functions of the body, has also extended to religious, not uniquely religious, but religious contempt for the natural world. The idea the world is just here to be exploited by man, etc. So that's definitely one, as you say, dangerous line of thought.
I mean, but my own view is that consciousness or spirit or energy, whatever you want to call it, is a kind of fundamental. It's one of the fundamental properties of the universe. You know, there is a kind of an all-pervading spiritual essence or energy which fills the whole universe. It's one of the fundamental sort of ground elements of the universe. This consciousness energy. And this energy becomes manifest within us as individuals. It becomes the essence of our beings. And I think the brain, or the nervous system, or the brain of any living being, the function of the brain is to allow this consciousness to become channeled into our own individual entities. So the brain is a kind of receiver, and a translator, a canalizer of consciousness or of energy. So in a very real sense, the energy of the universe becomes the energy of our own being. So there's really no difference. We are one with the energetic, the fundamental energy of the universe.
In considering there being this something much bigger beyond our five senses, which, as you say, serve their purpose, I love this idea of this one energy applying to us as individuals as well. I can't remember where it was I read it, but the counsel in this book was to, in the spirit of empathy and in the spirit of understanding, to look for the one in another. That is to say, to understand that, I am you, you are me, and if you allow yourself to be open on an energetic level, it really does. You can experience this sense of oneness, and I think that again this brings us back to Russell's teachings that is tangible if we can just let slide a few of the sort of layers of individuality that don't serve us.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the dangers with our strongly developed egos is that they separate us from other people. The ego walls us off from other people. We become islands of individuality. And on the one hand, that makes us self-centered, and it creates a sense of isolation and a fundamental anxiety within us because we are separate. But it also disconnects us from other people. We're likely to see other people as vehicles to help us achieve our ambitions or to help us fulfill our desires, just as we, see nature as an object to exploit. But when we lose that sense of separateness, when our ego isolation fades away, then we do become one with other people. We connect with other people. We become able to empathize. We feel compassion. And essentially, as you said, we're experiencing our oneness. We're sharing the universal energy which I just described. We experience it in ourselves. We experience it in other people. So in a sense, we are literally one with other people. and empathy and compassion are really just, an experience of our oneness.
Well, thinking about the state of the world as it is right now, and the comments that you just made, I would just say that the ego has its function, it appears, in this 5 sense reality, and that we're not describing, because some people resist what you were just saying as some kind of Borg type merging into, one, and the loss of identity. And that's why a lot of people, I think, fear death, because they think that they, as an individual, will be annihilated. But individuality is not somehow exclusively a bad thing. It's neither here nor there. So individuality is to be celebrated. We can celebrate our differences, whether it's individually or culturally, and this is what makes the world so colourful. But when it becomes very acute, then, as you say, it leads to sort of this exploitation and violence and dislocation. So I think it's about balance, really, and I think we could argue that in many ways we've tipped some of our thinking, our emotions, our systems, our attitudes just too far in one direction.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, that's a good point. I think that there's a misunderstanding that spiritual awakening means the complete loss of identity and the complete loss of individuality. I think particularly some non-duality teachers talk about no self, and that awakening or liberation means becoming nobody and completely losing your sense of identity. But I think that's false. I think the way to look at it really is that it's a question of degree. That in order to live in this world, in order to function in this world, we do need some sense of identity. We do need some sense of we need some ability to organize, to respond to the world, to concentrate. So we need some psychological functions to take place within us. So in order for psychological functions to take place, there has to be some kind of organizing center and some sense of identity. But the problem is that in our normal state, our identity is so powerful, so dominant, our individuality is so powerful, that ego is so powerful, that it becomes completely dominant. It takes over everything. It takes over our whole being. And the ego becomes the whole center of all our activities and the whole center of our lives. But in the awakened state, and in fact, there's a good analogy here that in the awakened state, it's a bit like, well, let's take our normal state first. In our normal state, it's like a city within a landscape. The landscape is the whole of our being, this kind of open, spacious landscape. And within that landscape, there's a city, which is our self system, or our kind of organizing psychological structure. And in our normal state, the city is so large, it's so powerful, that it separates itself from the landscape. It's a kind of self-sufficient, self-contained city, which is separate from everything. It's separate from space above it. It's separate from its whole landscape. And it thinks that it doesn't even need the whole of the landscape. But in the awakened state, there is still some sort of organization within the landscape of our being. But it's much more subtle, much softer. It's a bit like a kind of eco-town, if you like, which is totally integrated within the landscape, which has really no sense of separation from the landscape. So there is some sort of organizing identity, but it's much softer and much more subtle, and it's never separate from the whole of space or the whole of the landscape itself.
Whether you take a scientific view of the world, a materialistic view of the world, or religious or spiritual, whether you think there's anything to the idea of past lives and whether we have some kind of consciousness exists beyond the body, or whether you think that's all nonsense, the point is that I'll never be Greg Moffat again. You'll never be Steve Taylor again, whether we rot in the grave or whether something else happens to our essence. So that being the case, this is one go round in whatever way you look at it.
Yeah.
So celebrate that, celebrate who and what you are, but just walk softly amongst your fellow creatures and on the earth that you find yourself on.
Yeah, I mean, the world is not an illusion. It's the world we perceive is not illusory. It may only be a partial reality. It may not be everything. But it's not an illusion, just in the same way that the self is not illusory, and the self should not be done away with altogether. even if we don't perceive the world in its entirety, it's still a beautiful, incredibly vibrant and vivid place. And life, even if this is not the only life in this form, on this planet, in this dimension, is incredibly precious, and it's fragile, it's temporary, and therefore it should be valued. I mean, I've got friends who are Buddhists, and Theravada Buddhists can be quite a little bit world-denying. They can sometimes say things like, I don't want to be born again, this world is a place full of suffering, and I'll be glad when it's all over. But I always say, well, no, I'm incredibly grateful. I'm really grateful that I was born into this world, even though it's not perfect, even though life has its stresses and challenges. I feel incredibly grateful, that the world is an amazing place, and I feel incredibly appreciative that I'm here now, that I have this short lifespan to try to fulfill my potential in.
Oh yeah, I mean, being incarnated as a human at this time on this planet, what a ride. Just hold on.
It's a time of crisis, it's a time of danger, but it's a great time to be alive as well. We have opportunities which our ancestors never had. All of my ancestors were factory workers or peasants who had no free time and no opportunity to fulfill their potential. So I feel incredibly grateful that I have this opportunity to unfold what's inside me and allow what's inside me to manifest itself.
Steve, today we've been talking about a new book that you've worked with Russel Williams, Not Other Than I, The Life and Teachings of Russel Williams. That's widely available. I don't know if you want to share details of your website or anything else that you may be working on coming down the line.
My website is www.stephenmtaylor.com. So that's Stephen with a V, M for Mark, stephenmtaylor.com. And I do occasional talks and workshops which are advertised on my website. And people can join my mailing list. I do online courses as well from time to time. So all of the information on my activities is on my website.
Splendid. Well, Steve, thank you so much for joining us once again today on legalizefreedom.com.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. I really enjoyed it.
Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, check out the website, which is legalizefreedom.com. That's legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programs offering alternative views on a wide range of topics, including politics and economics, energy and environment, culture, spirituality, history, and the nature of reality. You can also browse and buy a range of publications from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Whether you listen, donate, or do both, I greatly appreciate your support. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizefreedom.com.